Okay, since now we know about the integers and floats, let's dive into the variables. So we cannot go on with predefined values all the time because we may want to change the numbers as we go along. Because why? Because maybe you need an input from the user, or maybe you need an input from the internet. Okay, so you're going to download a number and store it into a variable. So we store some values into the variables so that we can reuse them anywhere, anytime we want, and we can change them afterwards in anywhere, anytime we want when we try to code. Okay, so we are multiplying 0.5 with 3 in this case. Maybe this number will need to be 4 at some point. Maybe you're dealing with a user age number. Okay, so user age will increment in along the way. So we don't want to just write 3 or 1 or 1 million in a single code most of the times, but rather we want a variable. We want a value that we can store those numbers into, and we want to change it or we want to reuse it in anywhere we want. So let's do this. What I'm going to do, I will just sum 3 and 5 together. And then later on, let me mark down this and write variables in here and hit Shift Enter. Let's do this with variables. Let's say that x is now 3, okay, and y is equal to 5. Now, whenever I call x, I get the value of 3 in my code. Whenever I called y, it will give me the number of 5. So if I type x plus y, it will give me 8. For example, if I want to x to the power y, it will give me 3 to the power 5. Okay, so as you can see, now I can use x and y in the code whenever I want. So I defined x as 3 in here. So if I want to change this value, can I do it? Of course I can. Now I can say x is now 4. And from this point on, x is now 4. If I just say x plus y, it will give me 9 instead of 8 anymore. So whenever I change the value, from that point on, the value is 4 actually. Let's do an example about this. Let's say we get an input of radius of a circle from the user and I want to find out the circumference. Okay, and as you know, the circumference is 2 pi r, the radius. And how do we get the radius from user? We call a method called input. Okay, so if you type input and open a parenthesis, it knows that it has to ask for an input. If you just print, okay, we used the print methods before, right? So it printed out something. And as you can see, it shows in green. It means that it's a built-in Python function, okay, Python method. So input is something like that, and Python knows it has to ask for a user input in this case. So if you say r is equal to input of something, it will ask for an input from the user and it will just set the r value to the user input. And whatever you write in here within quotation marks, it will display as a message when asking input. If you hit Shift Enter, it will say r is, and this is where the user actually gives the input. For example, let's give 5, and now r is equal to 5. Now if I want to just multiply r to and 3.14, for example. And 314 is pi actually. As you can see, we get an error, okay? It says that can't multiply sequence by non-int type of float. So when you get an error, what do? You got the error message here, right? So if you don't know what this means, what you can do, you can copy this and open Google, okay, and just paste the message here and hit enter. And most probably you will end up with a website called Stack Overflow and any other resources for Python as well. Let's go into Stack Overflow and let me zoom in a little bit. As you can see, Stack Overflow is a great website where developers share the solutions with each other. So you ask a question and people try to help you for free. And there are tons of questions that are asked before, so there is a pretty good chance you will find whatever you are looking for. Okay, so for example, I found out the same error message that we are getting in Stack Overflow, and if you go down, if you go below, you will see it has 6 valid answers, and people are trying to help each other and trying to make people understand the problem. Okay, so of course you can browse the other questions, other resources from Google as well. And don't worry, I will explain what this problem is in a minute. But for general programming purposes, I really suggest you to look for Stack Overflow results in Google and try to understand the error message that you are getting. Okay, so let's go back to our code, and the problem is here is that R is not an integer or a float actually. R is actually a string, and whenever a user gives an input, it is stored as string, a text. We didn't see strings yet, we will see in the next lectures, but just know that they are basically texts, okay? So how could I know that? If I had written type and pass x as an argument, it will give me out an integer, okay? So if you want to learn about type of some variable, you will just say type x. And let's, for instance, define our pi number 314 in a variable, and if I type pi, it will give me float because this has decimals and x is 4, so it's an integer. So let's try r in this case. So if I just call r, it will give me 5, but see, this has quotation marks. So this isn't actually an integer. This is a string. So if I type r and hit shift enter, it will say that it's a string. So how can Python multiply a string with a float? So if you want to just multiply Jack, for instance, with 5, maybe you can multiply it because you can just write Jack 5 times. But you cannot write Jack 3.5 times, 3.14 times, okay? So it doesn't make any sense. So if I want to multiply x and pi, it's okay because they are both numbers. But in our case, we need to make sure that 5 is stored as a number, not as a text, because we don't have capability to multiply texts by numbers, especially with floats. Okay, and we will see that in detail in the following lectures, but for right now, know that you have to store this as an integer. And in order to do that, I will create a new variable called r_int, and this will be integer version of our R string. And in order to do that, I will just write integer R, okay? So this is known as casting, and if I call rint right now, it will give me 5, and if I call type rint, it will give me integer. Now I have an integer and I can find my circumference in that was my point in the first place, right? So now I can multiply r integer with x and with pi without getting any errors. And please note that this is known as casting. We casted the string to be an integer. So let's try to multiply all of this together and we get the final result. Okay, so now we have learned about storing values into variables. We learned about different types of actually numbers and different types of data structures and what can or what can't we do with them. Don't worry at this point because we're going to learn much more about them in the future, but I just wanted to show you a preview. Now in the next lecture we're going to see how we can download and open this Python notebooks.